This is I don't know if you necessarily call it a module. It's just a tool that I use to kind of talk about where money flows. For the last couple of years, now that I'm in the position I am, I've really thought deeply about what does the Bible say about money and where it flows. So what I'm about to share with you is what I found. I do want to say a couple caveats before I go there. This is not an exhaustive treatment of money in the New Testament. I don't really touch on the Gospels, and so there's a lot going on in there. And this can run up. Also, what I'm about to share with you will run up against a massive argument in hermeneutics between what is described in the Bible and what is prescribed in the Bible. So, any rate, either way, what I'm going to share with you hopefully will give you some principles and guide you in terms of how you give money. Also, this module is not for those who are not giving. It's probably more for those who are already being generous toward the kingdom. And this might just give you some more freedom or parameters. So what I'm going to do is in the center, best I can, I'm going to use the symbol for money in the United States here. Certainly this won't work in other parts of the world, but I'm just going to put a money sign right here in the middle. And so we need to ask the question, where do we see money flowing in the New Testament? What directions, the primary directions that we see? Now, the first one probably comes somewhat, I would say, I would hope intuitive. And I'm going to put an arrow going in like this. And it's one that, like I said, it almost comes naturally. You can, it goes without saying, it's what I call internal need inside the body um, of the church. Internal need. This is going toward existing believers inside the church or those who are in the fellowship. And so we see this in two very significant places in the infant church in Acts chapter 2, verse 45. And then we see it in Acts chapter 4, verse 32. And then I'm going to reference another passage here just for the sake of what we learn from it, which is right there in the same vicinity as Acts chapter 4, is Acts chapter 5, verse 2. And this is actually 32 through 34. So let me quickly read those, and I think you'll see real quickly what's going on here. So, chapter 2, verse 45. Right out of the gate, this is the infant church. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. It almost sounds like a commune. And then Acts chapter 4, verse 34 through 35. This is same Jerusalem church. Potentially, maybe a significant period of time has passed, maybe a couple of years, we're not really sure, that there were no needy persons among them. Just let that just sink in the early church and these house churches. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to whoever had need. That's an interesting thought there, the apostles' feet. I would say here, just a couple observations. No one was needy among them. This is very likely to be in house churches where the need was very aware of, and you can meet it. And then just chapter right after chapter 4, I do want to make the note here. Ananias, Sapphira, not going to tell you about that story, but fascinating. With his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. So we already see this pattern that is being given to at the apostles' feet. So it suggests that the money was going to the leaders and then they were distributing it potentially to where the need is. So I just make that note here, just a minor note. Apostles, apostles' feet, or the leaders were distributing it to who had need. All right. Now, the next place we see the flow of money might not be quite apparent. I'm just going to put an arrow up like this, and then this is what we call upstream. Now, what do we mean by upstream? It's not a word we necessarily use in giving. It's referencing churches or ministries that have blessed you, or the church is there as a result of this church's efforts or church planting efforts. So we see the example of this. So upstream means is giving to a ministry, most likely a church that is without their efforts, this church wouldn't exist. So you're giving back upstream. So the first place we see this is in First Corinthians, or the example of it is First Corinthians. I'm going to abbreviate because it's a long word. Chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. So let me read that to you. And there's actually a lot we can glean from this passage. So here we go. Now about the collection for the Lord's people. Woo, notice that, the collection for the Lord's people. So money's going inward in some respect. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do. So now whatever he's telling the church at Corinth to do, he also told the churches at Galatia to do. On the first day of the week, wow, first day of the week, each of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. So there is some preparation. You thought this through, right? It's not just on the fly, you're thinking this through. In keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Well, why were they making a collection? No, that's why I go to verse 3. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem, where the church was birthed. So here we see a lot of cool stuff going on, a lot of things we can take away from. So we see an example of the money going back up toward the church and the saints in Jerusalem because there was a famine there. So that can even be, in some sense, considered internally. Want to make a couple notes here. They did it on the first day of the week. That's cool. It was in proportion to income, so which suggests there was some preparation, right? I mean, it wasn't spontaneous, but we do see some of that sometimes. So there's preparation. So here we go. Verse 2, internal needs, and upstream. Now, the next one I want to point out, again, might be obvious to some, but maybe not to others. And I'm going to put an arrow, and we're going to use a word again we might not normally use, but once I describe it, it'll make sense. Downstream. And this is just another way of describing what I would say church planting, any kind of activity, gospel sharing, that's extending the kingdom. And it might be people that have been sent out from your church, but let me show you the examples. These are really cool examples. So let me write them down first. The first one we see is in Philippians. Just going to abbreviate that. Chapter 4, verse 15 through 18. And then the other one is in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. So let me read these real quickly with you. And you Philippians know that in the early days of the gospel, I love that. Just that term, the early days of the gospel. Well, early days of church planting. This is on Paul's second missionary journey. When I left Macedonia, so he's writing this letter most likely 10 years after he had his second missionary journey. When I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you. That's cool. For even in Thessalonica, so that's where after Philippi, just it was a church or two later. This is just not long after he's in Philippi. They're already supporting his work in Thessalonica at the church he went to next. You sent gifts for my needs several times, not once, but several times. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the profit that is increasing to your account. Is that not cool? It wasn't about Paul. It was about what was going to be accredited to your account. That in itself is worth a sermon. But I have received everything in full, and I have an abundance, and I'm fully supplied, having received from Epaphroditus what you provided. Most likely, they're giving gifts at the time of his work when he was church man, and later when he's in prison, he's getting gifts. So they continue over years of period giving to Paul's work as he's extending the mission. So it's downstream. Here's another example. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. Now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that was given to the Macedonian churches. Corinth is in Achaia in the south. Macedonian, which was referencing the Philippi and maybe other churches, in the midst of severe trial, their overflowing joy, you're going to hear that again a little bit, and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. You're already starting to see postures of giving entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. This is so we see a downstream giving toward extending the kingdom outward. The money was flowing down. Now, the other place we see money, and this probably is very, this probably won't be much of a news flash. I'm going to put an arrow like this. This is probably the one that most people suspected we would start with. And I'm just going to put a stick figure here with a staff in his hand. And you know where I'm going with this. This is where we see money flowing toward leaders within the local assembly, or I want to put also laborers, maybe traveling laborers, just to extend it out a little bit. And we see this in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17. And then we see it in this obscure reference in John chapter 3 John, verse 8, where we see people traveling, laborers traveling from church to church. So I just read them just for sake. This should be the elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those who work is preaching and teaching. That's interesting. For scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. That actually comes from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, I believe. And it has something to do when animals are working a field, you feed them with the produce that comes from the field. That's just common sense. So here we go. The worker deserves his wage. And then 3 John verse 8, therefore we ought to support such people so that we can be co-workers, support, it's a word for resources with the truth. So that kind of goes without saying, very, very straightforward. Now, I do want to include one last little example. It's not a big one, but I want to put a star here because what we see here are churches making most likely collections for these sources or these destinations for money. But we do see in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 through 2, we see an individual, let's say individual, most likely giving directly to Paul resources. So let me show you this. Paul writing, I commend to you our sister Phoebe. There's a lot. Who is a servant of the church of Cenchrea, which is south of Corinth. So you should welcome her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints and assist her in whatever matter she may require your help. That's a lot of cool stuff going on there. But this is what I'm focused on. For indeed, she has been a benefactor of many and of me also. That word there is the word in some translations, it will say patron, which we get the word, last I remember this in my Greek, is prostasis, which can be used as someone who provides financial help. So we see some pretty cool stuff here. In just these handful of verses, we see it going upstream toward ministries and churches that have basically blessed this church, and the church might not be there unless this church had done something. We see internal need. That makes sense. That's just, yeah, needs, people within the church life of the church who have needs. And then we see the money flowing toward local leaders and laborers that are laboring maybe in a bivocational way or something like that. And then we see downstream. This is missions basically. And then we see an individual giving to Paul. Now, we got to deal with posture. And I've kind of touched on that already, in which posture, we could probably spend a whole module on that one. But I just want to put this over the top, just like this. What is the posture that should basically cover all of this? And so I want you to, I'm going to put 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And we're just going to read just a few verses 5 through 8. And I think you'll see here. So I thought it necessary to urge you, brothers, to visit you in advance and finish the arrangements for the generous gift you had promised. Then it will be ready as a generous gift, not as one who is grudgingly given. Remember this: whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously, are we hearing something here? Will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you've decided in your heart. So we see some type of preparation, and not to give reluctantly, under compulsion, but for God loves a cheerful and joyful giver, and God blesses you abundantly. So what is the posture of the giver? And so I'm just going to pick up a couple words here. Is generous. And I'm going to put over here the word joyful. So here's how I end. I asked the question. This is what I want to give you, maybe the freedom. Where can you be generous, and where can you give the most amount of joy? If it's, this is what turns your crank, then by all means meet needs within the life of the church. And that, I mean, whether that's paying rent, groceries, that's where you're going to have the greatest amount of just joy. If it's giving back up toward churches that have blessed you or ministries, then give there. That's going to give you the great amount of joy. If it's giving to leaders that you know by name who have labored among you and brought value and have blessed your family, then by all means bless those people. If your heart is wanting to go downstream toward current ministries that are extending the kingdom and are gospel sharing, then by all means let your money flow there. And also know that the money can flow directly from an individual to the ministry or to the person, or collectively from the church. Hope this has blessed you. And if you have any questions or anything or feedback, let me know.